All right. Welcome, everyone. So good to be back with you. We've got people coming into the space. I give it just a minute to allow a few more people to join. Welcome. I'm so glad to see people that have come back week after week. You're in for a treat today with Centennia. I'll give it just a moment before we introduce today's session. Timo's back. Caitlin's back. Galena. Oh, good. So good to see you all. Hey, Veronica. Glad you're here. John's with us. Hey, John. Hey, Barbara. Susan, welcome. All right, we'll give it just another 30 seconds or so. We'll go ahead and get started. And I'll just start with an introduction. You are here for the 8 of 9 part series called the Neuro-Inclusive Teaching Toolkit. And I'm so fortunate that myself, along with 8 wonderful, exceptional women from around the world, have come together to put together this webinar series. We all believe that it's important for schools around the world to have access to learning. We recognize that sometimes there's a financial barrier, so we wanted to be sure this was free and available to any school, to international schools, to local schools, to public schools. And I'm just really fortunate to be able to work with this group of women, and it's been really, really special. And today you're in for a treat. I want to start by just thanking our sponsor, Equip My School. Equip My School provides resources and supplies to schools around the world, including what you would need to set up your student support program and potentially your life-centered education program. So they're a great resource, and they've been really kind to sponsor us. I just want to say that be sure to register for the last session, which will be next week. And it's with Jessica from North Shore Learning. She's going to talk about calm environments and supporting teachers and the well-being of teachers in our schools. So it's going to be a really great way to end this series. We'll go ahead and jump into the learning now. I guess I can also say where we're coming from. Currently, each week when I've joined, I've been in a different country, and I'm currently in Rwanda, and Centennia is joining us from Argentina. And I'll go ahead and introduce her. Centennia is a colleague and someone I have just respected and admired for so many years. And so when it was actually her and I were talking about this idea of this, something like this, making learning accessible to schools around the world. And Centennia is an amazing practitioner that has inspired me for some time now. So Centennia, do you want to introduce yourself and just tell us what you're doing now, where you're at?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Centennia McNeil, and as Lauren mentioned, I'm in Argentina. I'm working as the Director of Student Support Services here at the International School, and I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and I'll talk a little bit more about myself when I share the slides with you. And so, yeah, it's exciting to be here, Lauren, and for this opportunity to share with like-minded people in the community, in the international community.
Absolutely. And I do just want to say as well, because people have asked about this, we have recorded all these sessions and they're all uploaded to YouTube, and they'll go live on October 22nd when the series wraps. So if there's learning that has happened that you've missed or that you want to share with your teams or other schools in your community, it'll all be available for free on YouTube here in just a week and a day. So we'll go ahead and jump into the learning. And Centennia, you just tell me whenever you need me to change your slides.
Thank you.
Or
Okay, so as mentioned, I will be facilitating today's conversation, and that will be around nurturing potential, supporting families on their journey to understanding and appreciating neurodivergence. And I will use neurodiversity or neurodivergence and disability interchangeably to widen our focus on disabilities in general. And so the field of special education or disability studies focuses on supporting the individual, of course, their family, and the community in which these families exist. So as we are aware, this work takes an intentional breaking down of social constructs that affects the family and the individual. And so this session in particular is looking at the models that affect the identity and cultures of people with disabilities, the impact that has on them and their families, and also how we can support these families in our varying communities. I will also give examples from the journey that I've walked And we'll also hear from you through storytelling your experiences in your various communities. So next slide, please. And so I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm an educational leader and advocate for people with disabilities. I have worked in Zimbabwe in the international community and also in local school settings and institutions. I am from the Ndebele tribe, which is known for geometric artwork, which we use to adorn our houses, and patterns of beadwork as illustrated in this image. And I welcome you today by saying, wherever you may be in the world. I've also worked in Cote d'Ivoire at the international school and extended my reach to work with local schools to support teachers in understanding disabilities and neurodivergence. And as mentioned, I'm now in Argentina as the Director of Student Support Services, overseeing an amazing team of educational specialists. And I continue to have links in the local community here through conversations with psychologists in the local scene, where we talk about different problems of practice that we see in our schools. And so my journey in understanding neurodivergence was a bit of a difficult one, and I will start with sharing how I watched my mother struggle to calculate basic math. And when we went to the store together, I saw how she struggled to calculate the change that was owed to us. And at home, I listened for hours about her childhood trauma and about how she struggled to read and write in school, and how she became the classroom bully to avoid being teased by other students. And as an adult, my mom went on to become a successful hairdresser. She attended a vocational college, and now she hires a bookkeeper to manage her finances. And even though she has made success, she still struggles with simple computation in day-to-day life and relies on her calculator. And she tells everyone that her biggest achievement was raising a graduate, who is myself. And my mother's disabilities went unidentified and unlabeled throughout her life. Little did I know that this was preparation to walk the journey for me with families whose loved ones are neurodiverse or have disabilities, and the work for advocating for creating equitable opportunities for people and families with disabilities or neurodivergence through empathy due to my mother's story. And as it would be, I also realized that I am dyslexic, and I also went unidentified when I was in school. And my own journey to accepting my own neurodivergence was a shorter one, because I learned more about myself as I studied to learn to help others. And so we will look at the different models of disability, as I mentioned before, to anchor us to understand how societies have embraced or challenged ideologies around people with disabilities. Next slide, please. And so as human beings, we've come a long way from measuring the circumference of one's head to indicate intellectual capability to different models to try and understand people with neurodivergence or disabilities. And the focus has always been to try and classify these conditions and predict the impact of these conditions on the individual's quality of life, on their family and their community. And the clinical focus over time often misses the bigger picture about the lives of people with neurodivergence or disabilities. And in reality, it's society itself that creates the most significant barriers for people with disabilities. And these barriers include identity, the opportunity for one to reach self-actualization, and opportunities in the community. This is why understanding these models is important. They provide a framework to see how systemic barriers are created and how these also influence culture and the quality of life for families and people with disabilities. Next slide, thank you. And so some of you may already know about the medical model. And the medical model looks at a person with disabilities as being the problem that needs fixing or that needs to be cured. Next slide, please. And from this model, institutionalization of people with disabilities was instated. People with disabilities were kept away from society and even their families in some cases, and practices such as being locked away or restrained were enforced. And this also has created negative misconceptions about people with disabilities. And in some places, people still believe that disabilities are contagious. And as a result, it's sad to see that this is still a practice today. And a few years ago, when I was working in an institution where I worked with a wonderful group of teachers who are passionate about demystifying autism in Zimbabwe and Harare, the center became, or the institution became, a center for multiple disabilities. And one of the cases I had that really changed my view on disabilities was when a grandmother came one day to the center with a 30-year-old grandson who has severe intellectual disabilities, also identified as having autism spectrum disorder. He also had language and speech disabilities. But the saddest thing about his needs was that at 30 years old, and from all of his life, from the time his parents left him at his grandmother's house, he was left in the house and excluded from and society. And so when visitors came, he wasn't introduced to visitors. He was kept in a bedroom where he slept in one corner of the room. He ate in another corner of the room, and he relieved himself in the other corner of the room. And so our job was to rehabilitate this young man, to socialize with others, and to gain daily living skills. Now, that was one of the most traumatic experiences I've ever encountered, where people with disabilities, such as himself, are kept away from society and hidden away. And also, when we look at the medical model, it's also important to understand that special institutions also still serve a purpose, as this case in particular, where a therapeutic kind of pathway and a rehabilitation pathway is still important for certain disability types. All right. And at this point, I'd like to open up the chat to hear from you. What are misconceptions that you've heard in your context or in your culture in regards to people with disabilities?
Centennia, can you see the chat? Or I can read it to you. You see it? That they cannot learn. That's what Barbara shared. What other misconceptions? The context and culture matters so much with this, right?
Yeah.
Focus on fixing the individuals. That dyslexia is a problem instead of a superpower.
Mm,
Right. One neurodivergent person is one neurodivergent person. That's the way that Andrew Pfeiffer says it in his TED Talk. And this is so true, right, John? It doesn't look the same across individuals. Transition to independent living is not possible. Timo says they're less likely to succeed in life and achieve anything meaningful. Actually, Centennia, in one of my sessions yesterday, we looked at the beauty of neurodivergence at ASA, and this was something we were talking about, how so many of the big discoveries and inventions and solutions to problems throughout history have come from neurodivergent people, because the creativity is so much greater than people that are not neurodivergent.
absolutely. We become better people. We become better human beings and innovators when we remove barriers and look for opportunity to support people with various disabilities.
Caitlin says one thing
Yeah.
she's seen across her context is that the goal is always higher academics.
Right, right.
Sickness, right?
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And we will move on to the next model, which is the social model that most of you are aware of. And the social model then looks at the physical environment and societal attitudes that exist. And because of this, the advocacy to remove those barriers is as a result. So social justice and laws for inclusion have been a result of this model. And also, which is really important for me, which I really advocated for, especially in Zimbabwe, was the constitutional rights of people with disabilities, the awareness and access to knowing what rights protect people with disabilities was also important work that I advocated for. And then also moving away from the medical model and institutionalization, special schools, remedial classes, integration, and full inclusion, and also participation in university was as a result. Vocational centers as well, and employment opportunities for adults with disabilities was a result. Participation in sports and recreation, and accessible transport and related services. So, in various contexts, the challenge with this model is the resources, having sufficient teachers, material, infrastructure, capital, and in some places, the classrooms might be overcrowded. That is usually a challenge in some schools to making sure that full inclusion occurs. And so, what I've seen as well is a lot of countries take on inclusion laws, however, do not provide funding to ensure that schools are supported for successful inclusion. And that's just not in Africa. It's also, I see that in my context here in Argentina, there is a push for inclusion. However, there's limited resources of teachers with the relevant skills. And I always say that when I was in university, disability studies or special needs studies had the lowest number of teachers or people interested in enrolled in those classes compared to other classes. So it is definitely an under-resourced field. And so I'll leave it over to you. What does inclusion look like in your setting, and what is one challenge you've observed? So either or in the chat, please.
Centennia, have you found that oftentimes schools, like the model that is represented in schools, could actually look a lot different than the model that's in the country where the school exists?
Yes, this is true. That's true for us here. I think in the context that we're in, institutionalization is still prominent. And I guess it's a way that the government can channel certain funding in different ways. And so the life-centered education program, for example, institutions which are under the Ministry of the Medical Field, the Ministry of Health, and then educational institutions are a separate entity. And so our school is different because we have both on our campus, the life-centered education program where we try for inclusion. But I think in general, we're moving away in Argentina in general from institutionalization. The government is really pushing for inclusion. However, there are many things that have to be put in place for this to be successful. So it can be different in international schools compared to the community because of all these different variables.
Mhm. All right, we have some responses in the chat. Caitlin says, in our school, students are completely pushed in, but students might have a specialist co-teacher that attends class with them. Heather said they're welcoming children into the environment, but under-resourced skilled teachers to best meet their needs. Alina says, inclusion for me is to erase borders and build bridges.
That's beautiful.
It is. I know you can see it, right? Barbara said, as you have mentioned, lacking financial means and lack of education among educators in society. Timo says the biggest challenge is a lack of trained and experienced teachers for inclusive settings and general lack of thanks for making this available to everyone. Of course, that was this physical accessibility for physically disabled as a challenge across the international school ecosystem.
This is true. This
And
is
truly
true.
just like across design across the world, not just in international schools, right? Like you walk into train stations that have tried to be inclusive and still, there's a gap to get on the train. There's like these small things that still can be
Make
barriers.
such a difference in one's life. This is true. And town planners in our countries, I don't know if they have people that have a lens of inclusion on their advisory councils to inform infrastructural change.
Exactly. I know that I know CIS mentioned that they have some schools that want support in figuring out how to build more accessible buildings, like when they have building projects, which is really exciting to me to know that schools are thinking in that direction.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Caitlin said, even the people you think would be trained, like learning support teachers, don't have ongoing professional development to stay current to their specific student needs. Right.
This is
Right. So you're
true.
still operating with something you learned 15 or 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, everybody. And so the next model is the moral or religious model. And this one is prevalent in especially my cultural context. And disability is seen as a punishment from God or from the gods. And it is seen as a sin committed by the individual and often maybe the parents or the lineage or the family. Some people see it as a test of faith. People with disabilities in the past were seen as being impure, but on the other hand, there's some beliefs that people with disabilities are spiritually gifted or favored. Some religions believe that people who are blind have received that special grace in order not to be able to sin with their eyes. And so disability, on the other hand, can also be seen as a gift. And also in today's churches, especially in my context from Zimbabwe, where I come from, a lot of churches believe that disabilities can be supernaturally healed. And so we've seen cases of people with disabilities being mistreated in the quest for the family to try and find healing through rituals, through different types of healing ceremonies. And we've also seen cases in West Africa about the abuse and tragedy of people with albinism in particular, where people with albinism are seen as having supernatural powers. And so abductions and certain rituals are seen. And so this is very sad because we still see these cases, and these cases have impacts, these views have a great impact on families accepting and walking the journey with their child with a disability. We can move on to the next model, please, which is the charity model. And this model looks at the person's impairment as part of their identity in a way that is a negative connotation. It also creates this feeling of unworthiness and pity for people with disabilities. They're seen as objects of charity who are to be cared for by the non-disabled and seen as passive recipients for help. And not active participants in their own lives. So there's like this power dynamic that's created between those with disabilities and those who do not have disabilities. And unfortunately, I've seen this perpetuated over time, and it still exists, especially in my context. And when I was in university, our professors told us that years prior, they had tried a drive where they were taking people who were begging on the streets with disabilities to vocational centers and giving them the opportunity to participate in vocational projects and sheltered employment. However, what they realized was that the people with disabilities were not interested to join the vocational centers. They preferred to beg and they preferred to just receive handouts. And so this model really disempowers people with disabilities. Okay, and so what have you observed in your city around this particular topic about the charity model?
And Tania, Katrina in the chat is with us. Glad you're here, Katrina. And she said, this saddens me, but must be addressed because the cultural context must be understood, especially in international schools where we apply a Western lens solely. It's true. We don't often talk about
Absolutely.
this, so I'm glad you're talking about it.
Absolutely. And I think also it's the community. So much happens in the community that frames how people with disabilities or neurodivergence are seen. And this has such an impact on the family. Definitely, we need to broaden our perspectives.
Interesting.
Yes, service learning.
Pluses and minuses of single disability focused schools. Uh, yeah, the what Timo shared about having a disabled person begging at a traffic light or other public areas with a able person that's receiving the handout. John makes a good point too. Like these mandates, you say the kids have to be in school, but then the school is not ethically able to serve the students.
Absolutely. And so we can see that these different models have such an impact on culture. And as someone mentioned, it's important to really widen our perspective around disability studies in supporting families. It's the culture, it's religion, it's all these different models that feed into how people view different disabilities. So the cultural implications of this is fear, pity, shame, superstition, and this negative view that is perpetuated of people with disabilities. And the family unit is often impacted and broken or strained due to the cost of services related and all the factors that we've spoken about. There are also misconceptions that exist, and when we're talking about different cultural viewpoints, I know when we started the Autism Society, there was a belief that autism itself was a Western disability, and some people still believe that. However, we've seen through research that it is a disability that can exist in any context. So there's still certain misconceptions such as that. And also, when I think back about the history being an African, when I was doing research about people with disabilities in Africa, it was said that people with disabilities were involved in regular life pre the colonial period, and they were provided with tasks in the community based on the areas of strength, and in the areas of weakness they were supported by the community, and so they were not ostracized from society. And when colonization happened and the educational system was constructed, people with disabilities from where I come from were now much more segregated. And I think someone earlier said inclusion and education is more academic. It's not about the full human being. And so the educational programs themselves and the curriculums that we adapted removed away opportunities for people with disabilities to be fully involved in society. And so we always ask the question, who is to blame? Next slide, please. And because most disabilities may be hereditary, the blame is usually placed on either parent. And in some African societies, it's usually placed on the women. And I've sat in difficult conversations with parents where you can see that the mother feels so responsible for their child having a specific diagnosis. And also, again, the financial burden can have such a huge impact on the family. And I've seen cases where separation, divorce, and sometimes even polygamy is seen as a solution to try and navigate having a child with a disability in the family. And in some cases, like the one I mentioned about the 30-year-old adult that came to the institution, children may be abandoned with grandparents by the family, the parents themselves. And so this is the reality we see. So quickly in the chat, can you add what you've observed in your cultural context around who is to blame when it comes to disabilities? Do you see similar?
Centennial, I was going to type mine, but I'll just say it while other people are sharing. In
Sure.
Rwanda, oftentimes the mothers are blamed, and the accusation is that they drank alcohol during their pregnancies or any type of neurodivergence. And so the children are often kept in the home because the mothers are fearful of what society and the public will think if they're seen with a neurodivergent or disabled child.
It's so sad, isn't it?
Galena said, I was a volunteer at an NGO which has special needs families. They try to give jobs and teach soft and hard skills to prepare people. But employers do everything not to hire.
And sometimes even with tax rebates from the government, companies still will not hire adults with disabilities. And so, in advocacy to provide some kind of income for adults with disabilities, I found that the sheltered employment model worked in the vocational centers that I worked with. And so we brought the work to the center, and then the transaction happened that way, rather than getting people with disabilities to go into the community and advocate for work. Because as Galina mentioned, companies still won't hire. Yeah, the blame game, as John mentioned.
Katrina, you're right. You're not going to draw people into a conversation if we're dismissive or judgmental of their perspective. Absolutely. You have to be
Yes.
open to listen and understand where beliefs and ideas are coming from. Heather makes a good point too, hiding or not assessing children because it could affect their jobs. Because the problem is right now the world gets very small when you have a neurodivergent kid because we don't have enough schools around the world to support those kids for those families that are transient. So we're talking about international schools most likely. But right. And if that wasn't the case, if every school could support every kid, well then some of that feeling the need to hide or have not be as transparent would go away.
And we have a similar case where we were not told about the severity of need. And when things went bad, it became even more difficult because we were not prepared to support. So it is important to build that trust in making, when parents disclose information, that we don't judge or we don't make it difficult for them to be as open and transparent in that process.
I'm going to put it in the chat, but what Barbara just said made me think we have an amazing resource in the organization Parents Alliance for Inclusion. It's a free
Mhm.
community for parents to build support and access resources. And so you should join us. Just search Parents Alliance for Inclusion. I'll drop the site in the chat. But that, Barbara, just so, as you said we feel alone, so that you feel less alone. That's the point of Parents Alliance for Inclusion. We're advocates, but also a community to support each other. It's a good resource and it's free.
Thank you, Barbara, for sharing that.
Shared. Perfect.
Thank you, John. And what I've seen in our community is we just started with a call to parents who have neurodivergent children to just join a support group. And interestingly enough, that support group grew tremendously. There is a need to support parents. Okay. And so we can move on to the next part of our conversation today, which is looking at the 5 stages of grief, which most of you may know, by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a Swiss American psychiatrist who pioneered near-death studies and is an author and developed the 5 stages of grief. And in disability studies, this model has also been adapted in supporting families and also the individual. And so just a disclaimer here that these tools are just to frame our understanding of the feelings that people may have and to develop empathy for others and for self as well, because we all go through the stages of grief in different ways. And also some of these stages may take years and others may happen instantly, and that's based on numerous variables, such as the support systems that may be available for the individual and family, resources, the cultural implications, societal perspectives, as we mentioned. And so these all have an influence on the way, the journey that a family may go through. And so the first stage is denial. Shock and disbelief may be seen upon receiving information, maybe from the school, about the concerns that teachers may be observing with the child, or receiving the diagnosis of a disability and the realization of the permanence of the disability. And it is a human defense mechanism. This is how we cope with anything new and shocking to us. And this may take time, and it's important that we give families that time. And sometimes families may not be willing to undergo a full evaluation process, or they may seek or to seek confirmation of the disability. And you might see this in your schools where families are not attending meetings, they're not responding to emails. You may see them in the hallway, but when you reach out to try and talk about the concerns that the team might be seeing, families may not be open to that. Sometimes they may hope that the concern goes away. At times, they also might minimize or downplay behaviors or concerns. And in some meetings, I've heard parents say something like, "Oh, I was like that when I was a child and I grew out of it." And so you might hear that kind of language. And sometimes a parent might also find their own diagnosis by looking up different characteristics that they may be okay with, and maybe just also trying to avoid what they may think might be the actual disability. So I've also seen that as well, and I'm sure you have. And then the next stage is anger. Now, this one is very tricky. The feelings and actions or frustrations can emerge. Someone said masking. Yes, absolutely. And anger can be directed towards anyone or anything. And this is the blame game again, blaming others, blaming the spouse, and also avoidance of the topic or anything related. Resentment can also be as a result towards others, towards the situation itself. And it's important to note that when dealing with this stage where parents may show angry behaviors or may have difficult conversations, it's important to extend grace and not to take it personally. So I've sat through very difficult conversations with families where there might be outbursts, and realize that that is out of pain, you know. I've also had to support parents at times when they have shown outbursts of anger, maybe outside and we're not in a closed environment, to take them away to a quieter environment to process information and also to protect their dignity. And so it's really important to protect the dignity of the families, to be patient and to also just walk the journey with them, withholding judgment, because we never know the full picture. The next stage is bargaining. And with bargaining, this one actually gives me a bit of hope, because when I get to this stage with some families, I get excited because they're now taking ownership or partnership with us. They're now in a partnership with us to try and find solutions and to try and find things that could work. And this is more open dialogue rather than the anger stage where fingers are being pointed and the school is not doing enough and this person is not doing. So the bargaining stage for me gives me hope, is that we're moving forward. However, these stages are not linear. Person or a parent could go back and forth between anger and bargaining. Anger might come in when something that we're trying is not happening quick enough. And so in a wider context, in the bargaining stage, the family may visit different doctors, psychologists, they may go to churches, spiritualists looking for a solution. They may also get involved in acts of charity in a way to exchange fate, is what research says. They may also try different treatments in order to cure the diagnosis. They may change lifestyle choices like diet, lifestyle choices. And also there might be a bit of frustration if the intervention doesn't seem to be working quick enough, and questions like how long will this be needed? When will I see results can be part of this stage. And again, like I said, they can go back and forth in the different stages. The depression can also be as a result, which is the next stage. We've tried all these things, nothing is working, and depression could set in. And this is deep sadness, as we all know. when the acknowledgement of the true extent of this loss is seen. And this look like overwhelm and hopelessness and a withdrawal from society. So that parent that might have been very active might just withdraw now when the realization is setting in of maybe some of the limitations or the barriers that this child may face, maybe academically, maybe in the community, maybe in the society. However, it's important for us to support families not to dwell in the state of depression. However, we don't have control as to how long they may stay in that state, but it's important to always share the strengths and the possibilities that exist with families so that they know that there are options later on for their child in life. And the final stage, which we all hope to reach sooner rather than later, is acceptance. And when one reaches acceptance, it's being okay with the disability. It's not giving up, but it's accepting and acknowledging the reality of the situation and learning to adapt to move forward. It's making peace with reality. And I've seen this done so beautifully with some families where they are hopeful, they look for strategies, their children are involved in so many things in the society, so many things in the community. They have nothing to prove, the family, and they embrace their child as they are. And the well-being of the child is at the forefront of all conversations. And these parents can also become advocates. They can become spokespeople, and some even become teachers of disability. And I've worked with amazing parents who became teachers in advocacy for their children. And this may take many years, and for some it might be a quick journey based on the support systems that are available. John has said it's important to note that many parents go through severe depression and may mask it well in public. This is so true. I think many of us mask depression quite well, and we wear it quite well because that's how we've learned to cope. It's a constant battle, says Barbara. Indeed, indeed. And this is why schools should be that soft place where it's okay to feel those feelings and to go through and to learn with the resources that are available. We shouldn't be the place that brings down the barriers that society has already imposed on the family and child. I see another comment as well. Educators when diagnosed with their children.
Right. Yeah, Katrina was
Yes,
saying,
hiring.
yeah, right. It's like you've been supporting kids maybe for years that are neurodivergent, but then realizing it's also your own child. Yeah. And then the hiring discrimination is a real thing as well.
Absolutely.
Yes, Sean, that's true. We also need these parents to join our boards.
Yes,
So there's a little plug. Join the board because then, yeah, you can push policy and practice.
absolutely. Okay. And so wrapping up this conversation, I would like to just pose, and I think we've said some of these things already, is the best supports for families is to extend patience. It's a journey and some things take time, and it's okay. Withholding judgment, walking into meetings without any judgment is really important. And even after the meeting, not holding any kind of judgment because we don't know the full picture. Understand the cultural context of the families that are in your schools and in international schools in particular, with such diversity of cultural difference. It's important to learn and not impose, like someone said earlier, a Western way of thinking. It's important to educate and demystify disabilities as you walk the journey with the family So share information that will support the family, and also do the work in your communities to demystify the labels that may be assigned to different disabilities. And also the realistic expectations for the child. And I always advocate for child-centered intervention plans. I always like to hear from the children strengths, what are their interests, what are their goals in life. It's really important that they are also involved in decision making, especially as they get older, in what their career path may be. And so having realistic expectations, and also to help the child learn what they're good at, what they may need help in. Those self-advocacy skills are so important to their holistic development. And in your schools, advocate for instructional change, infrastructural and environmental change, like we were saying, and that's systemic advocacy in your change, knowing the models that exist and how the educational system itself has really created barriers for people with disabilities. Do the work at uprooting some of these systemic barriers. And for families, the extended family, which I've seen in African cultures, goes a long way in supporting the family. Therapy and counseling is also very important for families, their children, and also the sibling. We always forget about the sibling who may not have a disability. It's also important for that holistic approach to supporting the family unit. Books and podcasts and support groups, and I think John put a link there. Those are also good places for families to find support and community where they can share without fear in safe spaces. And then funding and available resources. It's important. What I've done here is directing certain families to receive various funding that might be available through their governments, through their embassies, and even through our scholarship program. It depends on your community, but you'll find that those supports do help in certain situations. Well, thank you. And to end today's sessions for the educators in this conversation, I leave you with 2 provocations. What will you do to advocate for systemic change in your school? And what will you do differently to support the families you work with? Wow, the PTA is definitely a good group of change, of policy change, and to hold the leadership accountable. Absolutely.
Centennia, sometimes I think the advocacy for systemic change comes from understanding what the barrier is to the change. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, depending who are you talking to? Which stakeholders are you talking to? Then what approach do you take? You know what I mean? Like, do they need data to bring them along? Do they need a conversation about their beliefs and background and the culture that they grew up in? Like, yeah, I think sometimes it's taking the time to know what the obstacle is to the change, right?
Absolutely. Sure. Admissions, yes. Those stakeholders too. I work very closely with our admissions officer, and recently she asked if she could go and observe some of the classrooms so that she could understand what it's like for a child maybe with dyslexia or ADHD, or a child in our life-centered program, what a regular day looks like for their learning. Book clubs are definitely important and impactful. Making sure admissions departments and systems don't send the message, we can't accommodate you here. Language is so, so important. Yes. Making sure admissions understands how we work. Yes, how. It's the how that's important. Inclusion has to be purposeful. It really has to be done well. Thank you, Lauren.
This is such a theme across schools, being able to, from the beginning, getting it right, right? Like making sure parents know, we are going to do whatever we need to do for your kid from the beginning, and making sure we have the information to support that child well from the start.
Absolutely. And also, I also advocate for the correct placement based on student need, and so it should always be student-centered. When we place a student in a co-taught class, it should be for a specific reason, and when we pull a child out for intervention or daily living skills, it's for a particular reason. So that placement in different environments has to be intentional. It has to be planned so that the child gets the best experience, however inclusion looks like in your schools. We always want our students to be seen in their best light, and when they're doing very well. Continue to share information about student success. Absolutely, Caitlin, as they move between school divisions. Yes, it breaks down the assumptions about our ability to accommodate, include their long-term outcomes. Thank you, Caitlin. Absolutely. There's such a fear of teachers to openly talk about what they're seeing and are often told not to suggest testing, which really just holds the student back. Yes, absolutely. The recommendation for testing can be quite a difficult conversation. However, how you present it should always be data informed, I believe, and it should come from a place of seeking solution rather than just imposing kind of this recommendation that a family should undergo an evaluation. And I always believe that if we're recommending for an evaluation, we should be able to already be supporting that child. And when we get the evaluation, we should definitely follow through on our side to make sure that we fulfill and, what the requirements are, the recommendations that come out of that process are. So it goes two ways. It's not just getting the diagnosis, but what do we do with that information to improve the quality of life for that child?
That what Katrina just shared about testing just because the child is difficult, this is why we have to make data-driven decisions,
Yeah,
right? Like, it can't just
absolutely.
be, "This
Absolutely.
child is, yeah, difficult."
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And there's certain behaviors that are just, that's the age, and they might move a little more when they're younger. Like that, we really have to make data informed decisions, especially for children with certain demographics. Yes, some countries do not have specialists even. Absolutely. And also the evaluation process is a difficult one because some of the assessment tools are designed for a certain population, and also the language barrier could be a contributing factor as well to that assessment itself. Create community safe spaces.
This is great.
Thank you everyone for your contributions. This has been such a enriching conversation today.
Thank you, Centennia, for leading us through it, and thank you all for joining and being so engaged. We hope you'll come back and join us again next week.